Hello everybody, welcome virtually to Down County Museum and to our creative writing workshop which we're holding as part of Culture Night celebrations. You're all very welcome. I hope you get something out of this workshop. We'll be looking at some objects in our museum collection and using them as prompts for getting started on some writing. For those of you who don't know the museum, we are located in Downpatrick and we are in the old restored County Jail of Down, which opened in 1796. So as well as having restored jail buildings and cells, we also have 10 museum galleries which display thousands of objects relating to the history of County Down. So those of you who haven't been to visit us, you're very welcome. And for those of you who can't visit us, I hope you get something out of tonight's event. So we all know that museums can be great places to inspire creative writing, whether they display the works of the old masters who knew so much about suffering or interpret urban or rural working life. They hold within them objects which are resonant of emotion, memory, imagination. We can leave a museum feeling uplifted, sad, angry, bewildered or confused, and even that confusion can be a source of creativity and spark a piece of writing. So with all that in mind, we're going to look closely at a few objects from our collection of thousands of objects and see if they can get us starting on writing either a piece of poetry, piece of fiction, flash fiction, memoir, or even a few notes that we can go back to later on to try and write something. So we're going to start with graffiti. So this is a door casing from the old jail, uncovered behind wood panelling in the 1980s when the jail was being restored. Included in the door casing are several images, initials, names and messages that prisoners who are held here in the jail have carved with some sort of sharp implement. The door casing includes initials, so here we have WA12, that's 1812. They include things like a very crude gun, a cross, names, some images that we can't decipher, and a more substantial message here, which has a date, 1814, and the message says, James McCann confined 6 months by McMaster's perjury. And further on down, it says John Dorian of Kirkcudbright confined by McMaster's perjury. Now, James McCann and John Dorian were in the jail for a riot at Strangford Fair, and they obviously felt that they were here unfairly and that McMaster, whoever he was, had perjured himself, and they were confined here as a result of that. Very poignantly, James makes his S's back to front. So this is a message, this is a piece of graffiti, and a message which exists outside of official documentation. So outside of official paper records, here are some records in stone carved by the prisoners at the old jail of Down. So I thought as a starting point, you might like to consider any graffiti you have created in your time, whether you carved your name on a school desk when you were young, or on that school desk you carved the name of the band that you loved or the football team you supported. Perhaps romantically on a tree you carved the name of a boy or a girl you thought you loved. And I was thinking that we might consider where the graffiti we created in our past might be. It's unlikely to be on a piece of stone door casing in a museum, but perhaps the school desk is used somewhere else. Or perhaps it's even stored in a shed, or it might be in your house. Is the tree still standing? Or has it made a piece of furniture that is in somebody else's house, or has it been used as firewood? So what graffiti is in your past? What can you recall to your mind? What graffiti might you take as a starting point for your piece of writing? What memories does it conjure up? What do you have outside the official record of your life that you did perhaps carelessly or created carelessly when you were much younger? So take some time to jot down some lines about your graffiti, maybe even 3 lines as a starting point, thinking about the actual act of carving it or writing it. If it was not something you created, you might like to think about something somebody else created. Perhaps your child scrawling some words on newly painted walls or newly wallpapered walls. I remember my own child writing on a lovely cream sofa I had, taking a marker and writing, or trying to write on a sofa I had, and how annoyed that made me felt. We probably also all know of the pathways scored by cats and dogs and the prints of cats and dogs in cement. and that might be a starting point for your piece of writing as well. When you've done that, you might like to consider this extract from a poem by Maria McManus from her wonderful collection Available Light, published by Arlen House Press. And this is an extract from a poem called Emigres. 12. Even carrion crows sing love songs and kiss the lips of poets, gliding notes as small as stones, scrawling the heart's graffiti in the dust under your feet. And that's a lovely phrase, the heart's graffiti. So having considered the actual graffiti you might have created, you might now want to think about the graffiti on your heart's graffiti. What might be scrawled on your heart? Remember the phrase of Queen Mary, who said that when she died, Calais would be written on her heart. So what is in your heart? What graffiti is in your heart? Taking as an inspiration those lovely lines from Maria. So I hope you found considering graffiti to be useful, whether it's actual physical graffiti or the graffiti on your heart. And I hope you might find that a starting point for working on something. So we're in a very different space now. We're downstairs in our farming gallery, which is at the back of the cell block. It's a very large industrial looking space and displays objects from our farming collection. Objects very important in the history of County Down and showing how important farming was and continues to be in the county. And this wooden plough here was used in the Mourns, where it was easier to manoeuvre in the small and stony fields than the metal ploughs. It's a drill plough, so used for planting potatoes, for making the drills that the potatoes will be planted into. And it's painted bright orange, as you can see. It's quite a unique piece. Not very many of these survive. And even though metal ploughs were used elsewhere, wooden ploughs continue to be used in the Mourns. This everyday object would have been repaired, maintained, cared for. It was a precious object, as precious as the gold we have on display in the other part of the museum. So I want us to consider how important everyday objects are to us. How important things like our kettles, our irons, our lawnmowers, our hoovers are to us. And the calamity that might threaten to envelop us should one of these fail to work. Imagine getting up this morning and your kettle not working, so you couldn't have your tea before you went out to work. And perhaps also think about how the object feels, how it feels under your hand and in your touch. I dig with my grandfather's spade. It's very, very old and it's small. He was a small man, and sometimes it's called a lady's spade because it's smaller than a regular spade. Think about your iron, perhaps you've had it for years, and how it feels under your hand as it goes across, smoothing the creases out of shirts and blouses. Or think about how annoying the lawnmower is to start, and how much effort you have to put into it to actually get it to start. So the way our bodies accustom ourselves to the objects that we use every day, whether those objects are large or small, whether the task is regular or sporadic, something that we only do once a year or that we do every week. Think about those processes and the actual physicality of the object. This poem by Jane Clark from her collection When the Tree Falls, a wonderful collection by Blood Axe Books, talks about the act of ploughing, but in this case with a tractor as opposed to a wooden plough, and the physicality of that act. So I think it might add something to the prompt of our plough. Some days it's like ploughing in Wexford, not a stone to be found, and the soil dark as a night without stars. You grease the bearings, set the check chains, tighten nuts and bolts, mark the headland line. Leaving space at the end to turn the plough and realign the tractor. The trick is in keeping the first furrow straight. From high in the cab, you look over your shoulder at black-headed gulls, lapwings, starlings, rooks in their thousands, hurtling from all directions to follow the plough. So thinking about those phrases in particular, you grease the bearings, set the check chains, tighten nuts and bolts. With our objects, do we have certain processes that must be included? And you might perhaps want to write about the process and write quite simply and plainly, not in any kind of high-flown or poetic way, but just very simple, as if you were writing instructions to somebody. And in fact, your piece of writing might be an instruction on how to use this object: the plough, a tractor, a lawnmower, the tricks within that object, its little quirks that you need to know in order to get it to work properly. So think about writing an instruction for someone else to use a thing that you're well used to. So in this piece of writing, we are focusing on the physicality of the object, its shape, its touch, its feel, how it's used, and we're including in our piece of writing instructions for how our object should be used. So sitting in the floor, in a special case built into the floor here, is a Norman grave slab dating from around the 13th century. It is obviously a very long, heavy piece of stone, and it has a key carved onto it, indicating that it's probably a female grave, men's graves having swords. There's a smaller grave slab sitting above it, which has a shears on it, definitely a woman's grave. Only about 40 of these survive in Ulster, and they're all found in Lecale, North Down, and the Ards, the area where the Normans had the greatest influence and where their influence lasted well into the 15th century. The style of work on the grave slabs indicate probably the work of an English stonemason, and the Normans brought over from England a lot of stonemasons, potters, minters of coins, and so on. So it's a very interesting piece. Obviously, grave markers are very rare at this time, and grave markers only mark the graves of the wealthy, the powerful. Most people's graves are not marked, and are not marked for hundreds and hundreds of years after this. But I suppose what's really interesting from our point of view about this piece is the hole in it. Because the hole shows where hundreds of years later this grave slab was repurposed as a gatepost. And in Seoul, a gate hung from this post into a field. So this very high status, sacred, religious object was refashioned many years later as a practical thing, a piece of stone, a large, good piece of stone to hold up a gatepost. And many objects in museums have been refashioned and repurposed to have some other kind of use. They either become practical things, so departing from their sacred roots, or they become relics and souvenirs, acquiring a kind of sacredness, if you like, from what was maybe a very practical tool or piece of equipment. So I would like us to think about how objects go on a journey sometimes from being sacred, high status, to being very practical, or how they might go from being very practical to being almost sacred, a kind of relic. And to help us on the way, I thought we might use this poem from Gerald Dawes' collection, The Last Peacock, published by Gallery Press just a couple of years ago. And it's a very short poem called Ely. When the soldiers stormed in to Our Lady's Chapel, Ely, they didn't hang about. The graven images were rooted out. Now only headless figurines remain. But where do the sculpted heads end up? Buried within a tunic pocket, ground to dust in some soggy field, or peering like a holy relic from a farmhouse mantelpiece. Do you have something in your possession that had some other purpose or function before you had it? Do you have a 19th century shoe last as a doorstop? Do you have a stone hot water bottle sitting on a shelf as a decoration? I remember as a child the great vogue for covering spirit bottles in putty and sticking shells onto them to make bases for lamps. We all have something that we have refashioned or repurposed from something else. And we all have objects in our houses that perhaps had a very different use from the use that we now confer on them. So for your next piece of writing, you might like to consider the journey an object takes. Has your object had a practical use at one point and now has pride of place on your mantelpiece or on a shelf in your house? Have you a relic from a sacred place you visited? Or have you made something into a relic of your own past? Objects hold within themselves the ability to stir emotion as well as memory. Or you might want to consider the motivation of the person who has repurposed the object. The farmer who found this fantastic piece of stone and thought only about its size and shape and how useful it would be to make into a gatepost. or those soldiers storming into Ely Cathedral who took with them souvenirs of their victory, or the objects that you have taken from somewhere else, the shells from a beach, the stones from a field, the souvenirs of places you've been to, the memories that those objects hold within them. But I want us to focus really on repurposing and refashioning, changing an object from one thing into another, changing its use from sacred to secular or secular to sacred. The whole process of making an object into something else. So try and jot down a few ideas of things that you might have that have made that journey, or focus on the objects here and the journey they have taken. These grave slabs that were sacred, then they were practical, and now they have become sacred again in the space of the museum, where they sit with other slabs and other stones. And these ones here all have sacred symbols inscribed on them, crosses, shells, and so on. So these objects have reacquired, if you like, a religious sacred purpose. And consider that perhaps in your writing as well. How do we confer importance on things? What are the most important things in our homes? What are the relics that we could not do without? I suppose if we're thinking about refashioning and repurposing things, then quilts are among the best examples, being made of hand-me-downs, discarded fabric, old pieces of blouses, shirts, dresses, any fabric that's to hand. This poem by Paula Meehan conjures up a kind of quilt that we might all have been familiar with as children. The quilt, it was a simple affair, 9 squares by 9 squares, blue on green, spots, stripes, bows alternate with gold and red chevrons. My grandmother's quilt I slept under the long and winding nights of childhood. Above the bed a roundy window, my own full moon. I loved the weathers wheeling past, the stars, the summer suns, my auntie's deep breaths, distant thunder. Our quilt, which we call the Killaloe quilt because it was made in Killaloe, was made by Martha Geddes in the late 19th century. Martha died in 1910 of consumption, as was the fate of lots of people of that time. This is known as crazy patchwork. So crazy patchwork doesn't depend on repeating design or regular pattern for its impact. It depends on the impact of the individual pieces of colourful fabric sewn into it. The fabrics used in this quilt are velvet, silk, silk corduroy, grosgrain, brocade, chenille, ribbon, satin. So quite rich and luxurious fabrics. The colours are very bright blues and reds, alternating with lighter patches of yellow, pinks, pale blues. The rich reds, blues and purples were made from the new synthetic dyes that were coming out at the time, and some of this fabric may have come from America. The stitches are herringbone, feather stitch, blanket stitch and embroidery. On the quilt, Martha has embroidered various initials, names and slogans. She has half moons, American flags, some boats. She has the slogan Erin go Bragh, she has good night, she has sweet dreams, all of those words embroidered onto the quilt. She has the names of her pets, her dog, wee Charlie. And she also has the name of her betrothed, her fiancé Charles the Courteous, embroidered onto the quilt as well. Charles actually jilted her, so obviously he wasn't that courteous. So it's a very personal and fragmentary record, a bit like James McCann's message on the door casing at the very beginning, a record that exists outside of official records. And I want to consider, if you were making a quilt, what kind of fabrics you might use. Because we can imagine when Martha made this quilt, she may have been beset by the memories of the pieces of fabric she was using. She might have remembered where she wore that dress, even how much it cost, where she bought it. She might have remembered the person whose dress was now in the fabric or the bodice handed down. She might also have included things that she didn't like. Perhaps she was glad to get rid of a certain blouse, bodice or skirt and cut it up to use into a quilt. So quilts hold within them the memories not just of themselves, but of all the pieces of clothing that go to make up the actual quilt. So for our next piece of writing, I want to consider how you might make a quilt. what fabric you might use. Would you use old dresses, parts of a wedding dress, a christening robe, waistcoats? What colours would you put together? What would be your dominant colour if you had a dominant colour in your quilt? Would you embroider anything on it? And if so, what might you embroider? The initials of friends, or family, loved ones. If you were very skillful, you might embroider not just a cat's name, but a cat itself. Are there slogans you would include on your quilt? Sayings, pieces of poetry, pieces of songs, would they go into your quilt? Martha left us a lasting impression of Charles the Courteous, but obviously he didn't treat her very well. Would you want to include the initials, names, or actions of somebody who did you harm as opposed to doing you good? Might your quilt be not a celebration but an exorcism? Might your quilt be made up of things that you actually hate, pieces of clothing you never liked wearing, pieces of clothing that conjure up bad memories? Might your slogans be curses as opposed to prayers? Might the initials of the people you're including be the people who've done you wrong, as they say, rather than who've done you a good turn? I love a textile poem, and I think quilts are very close to poems or other pieces of writing. The pen is like a needle. The words are like stitches. And all of the random thoughts that we might have can come together in a piece. So the randomness of Martha's quilt doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that the pieces aren't regular. The individual pieces aren't regular sizes. The effect is definitely crazy as opposed to regular. But it's so beautiful and so colourful, and the little designs on it are lovely, that we don't care that it isn't regular, it isn't repeating, it isn't symmetrical. So I hope your piece of writing is like a quilt and includes many random things brought together in it. And I hope that you either use it as a way of celebrating something or exercising something. So try and make your piece of writing as much like a quilt as you can. Learning how to sew, embroider and create textile pieces was central to the education of women and girls in the past, and we have many examples of the work of those women in the museum's collection. For working class women, learning how to sew was of course of huge practical use, looking after their families' clothes and their own clothing, or working perhaps as a seamstress. For middle class women, the creation of beautiful pieces of textiles filled their days, which were often a lot emptier than ours, as they had servants, nursemaids and so on. One of the things that young girls often did was to produce samplers, and samplers were a way of perfecting your sewing skills. I'm sure we've all seen samplers in museums. Samplers traditionally included Bible verses, prayers, letters of the alphabet. The sampler made by Jane McKee of Killaloe is showing letters of the alphabet and numbers, and a verse saying, "Remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth." And the one made by Sarah Fitzpatrick is a sampler including the Lord's Prayer. So prayers, Bible verses and so on were very, very commonly found in samplers, although there are very many more elaborate ones that you may have seen as well. And I suppose significantly, unlike many other objects, textile pieces hold within themselves the possibility that they can always be unravelled or undone. And they remind me of this piece by Jessica Traynor from her collection Liffey Swim, published by Daedalus Press. And this is a poem called "I Unstitch the Sampler." There is a future I have already made, and I am stealing it fibre by fibre from myself. I take the memories apart, stitch by stitch, and knot by knot, until the sampler frays, and I can no longer see babies, bottles, soothers, coffee cups stuck among the weave. They all fall down, rubber ducks, wedding rings, cat collars, spider plants, in a pile of faded silk, and I'm alone with a thread in my hand, no notion where it ends. And I was thinking that in these days of pandemic and post-pandemic and lockdown and more lockdowns and uncertainty, all of the things that we have sewn tight into our days are very liable to unravel. So I was thinking that we consider not the weave of our lives, because that's far too big and complicated, but perhaps the weave of our pandemic days. In the days where we have been working from home, homeschooling, going out for only permitted exercise, being very careful, wearing masks, worrying about vaccinations, worrying about our elderly relatives, all of those pressures that have been on us in the last year and a half. So perhaps in our stitched tight days, we might like to write about what might come tumbling down if we were to unpick the stitches or pick away at a frayed edge. In Jessica's poem, all kinds of things come tumbling down: cat collars, spider plants, coffee cups. What have we stitched into our pandemic world? What do we hope to let go of when this hopefully comes to an end? So considering the samplers, if we were to write a post-pandemic piece that looked like a sampler, what kind of verse or prayer or hope or wish might it contain? Or alternatively, as the pandemic has stitched us even tighter into a narrower and narrowing world that we hope to be coming out of, how might we unravel those stitches and that tightness and try and face the future? So your inspiration can either be something that is sewn tight, woven tightly together, or the unraveling that happens when you pick at the stitches of either your sampler or, in this case, your piece of writing. So it seems appropriate to finish here in the cells of the 18th century jail of Down, since we started with the door casing where James McCann left his mark. Among all the information we have about the jail, its systems, its procedures, its prisoners, there's even more that we don't know. Some of our prisoners are well documented. They live in the official documents. Some have left their marks behind them, like James McCann. But most are unknown and unknowable, except, of course, in imagination and in the echoes that might be in these walls within the county jail. And as we're finishing here in the cells, it seems appropriate to include an extract from a poem by the great Downpatrick poet Damien Smith, and this is from his collection English Street, published by Templar Press. And we're on English Street, the jail is on English Street. And there are a couple of poems in this collection about the jail, but I thought I would include this extract here from a poem called The Myra Road Remembrances. Just a short extract. Among the ordinary dead, there is nothing to commemorate or remember, and no one to do the remembering for them. And it remains true that the landscape itself bears witness at all times, so that even the council houses at Ardpatrick, the squat stones at Ballyknoe, still turning their circle beside the railway lines, which are no longer there, but have set Celandine on the run along the raised sleepers, retain the awareness of each small human action, generation by generation, along the Tarmacadden routes, forgetting nothing, remembering nothing, leaving nothing. So if the landscape itself bears witness, you might want to think about a place you have been and what memories might be included there. So not a place that is famous or commemorated or memorialised, but some ordinary place, the side of a ditch, a riverbank, a road, a stretch of dual carriageway, a room in your house, a room in a building you've been to, a stretch of beach. Somewhere ordinary, where there are no memorial stones, where there are no monuments, where there are no commemorative plaques. What those places hold within themselves, the memories of the people who have passed by, the small human actions, the everyday acts that have taken place in those landscapes, within those rooms. Think about those and use those as starting point for pieces of writing that are about the dead that no one is there to remember. So I hope you've enjoyed our short creative writing workshop for Culture Night. I hope you've enjoyed looking at the objects even though you've been looking virtually. I hope you found some inspiration and some ideas to get started with writing. So as I said earlier, whether you want to write poems, fiction, flash fiction or memoir, I hope these objects have inspired you in some way. I hope you've enjoyed looking at them. I hope you have enjoyed listening to the poems which have accompanied them. I hope you've got something to get you started on your journey writing your way through objects and through history and through your own lives. Thank you for joining us. The museum is open from Wednesday to Saturday, 10 o'clock to 4:30 p.m. Admission is free, so do come in and see us. We'd love to see any pieces of writing you've created as a result of today's workshop. If you want to know anything else about the museum, or you want to get in touch for any more ideas, or you want to get in touch to look at a particular object, then please do contact us either via our website, www.downcountymuseum.com, or you can email me, linda.mckenna@nmand.org.